When I first taught my way through this section of the Old Testament, it was the winter of 2019. We started in September of 2019, and that was just 2 months after my husband's death in July of that summer. And so this lesson is fairly early in the class year. It's only about lesson 6 out of 30. So it was still the fall. I was still in the middle of the stress and the trauma and the loss and the pain of Len's death. And here comes this lesson about Naomi and the bitterness and struggle that she had with the losses in her life. And I could relate. But I could also see, even in the middle of it, that God was providing for me. Just one example, and there are many, just one example was that we had always had cows on our property, and we'd always wintered our cows over. We'd kept them year round. And that year, Len had decided that he didn't want to be bothered wintering cows anymore. And so he made arrangements that summer with a guy who was going to bring his animals to our property, and he would leave them there through the spring, summer, and fall, and then take them away in the winter. And Len had already made that arrangement at the time of his death. And so that first winter, I didn't have to go out and chip ice off water troughs. I didn't have to figure out how to strap huge hay bales to the tractor and haul them out there for the cattle. I didn't have to go out in the pouring rain and deal with them in the middle of winter. God provided the solution to a problem that I would have found pretty overwhelming. And he provided it before I even knew I needed it. It was his providential care for me. Now, the story of Ruth is a story about the providential care of God for her and for Naomi. And it takes place during the time of the Judges. I'll talk a little bit more about the period of the Judges next week because we are skipping over that particular book in this study. It's the whole book is pretty much a series of similar situations, just kind of rinse, repeat. I mean, it's just one thing after the other. You do the same thing over and over again. And so we are skipping over the book. But there is no king in the land at the time of the book of Ruth, and the people are struggling with these cycles of idolatry. And the story begins with a famine in the land. Now, this is likely not a famine caused by a shortage of rain, a drought. And the reason that I say that is because as we go through this, we read that there's bread in Moab. Well, Moab's only 75 miles down the road. And usually when you have a drought due to weather problems, those weather systems cover a very large area. And so you wouldn't have no rain in one area and plenty of it just 75 miles away. And so probably this was a famine that was caused by a shortage of food due to an oppressor who had conquered Israel and was coming in and taking the best of their crops every year and leaving them with nothing. And this was probably an oppressor that God had allowed due to their idolatry. Due to the shortage of food in Israel, this man named Elimelech had taken his family to Moab to live. And that is present-day Jordan, in case you're interested. His 2 sons, when they were in Moab, had disobeyed a command of the Lord and had married Moabite women. And then they hadn't been there very long when Elimelech died. His sons later died as well, neither of them having had a child. And so Elimelech's wife, Naomi, is left alone in Moab in terms of her immediate family, she's the only one left. And in her household are 2 other widows, and they are in a bit of dire straits. Her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law and her. Now we know that Naomi is a believer in the Lord. Perhaps her husband was as well. We don't really know if she encouraged her sons in these marriages to Moabite women or if she tried to talk them out of it. But we do know that she was kind to her 2 daughters-in-law, and they loved her. Naomi, however, is now really in a perilous situation here. She's far from her own land, far from her own home and family. Her husband and her sons, who had worked and provided for them, were gone, and she has no support here. And meanwhile, she hears that back in Bethlehem, God has provided his people with bread. This probably means that whatever oppressor was taking the food from the land at the time has been removed because Israel has returned to the Lord, and so God has removed the oppressor from them. And so Naomi decides to go home. In her own town, she has relatives and friends, and perhaps there will be someone there who will help her and support her in her need. Her two daughters-in-law want to go with her, and Naomi tries to talk them out of it. She knows that there is nothing for them in Israel. She has no other sons for them to marry. They would be foreigners there. They would be poor because she has no way to provide for them. She can't even provide for herself. And so poverty awaits her. When she goes home, she thinks they would be better off returning to the homes of their fathers and seeking another husband, for they're each still fairly young. One daughter-in-law turns back, but the other one, Ruth, insists on going with her. And we will see as we move through the story that Ruth is going with the intention of caring for Naomi. There is this crucial moment of choice for these two women. Orpah, the one who decided to stay in Moab, chose to remain with the idolatry and godlessness of her own country and hoped that she would find a new husband there. Ruth made a decision, a different choice with very different consequences. And I'm going to read to you chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. These are very well-known verses, but they explain her choice and what would result from them. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." So Ruth knowingly chose not only the homeland of Naomi as her own, but also Naomi's God. And God has used the coming of Naomi and her family to Moab and the death of Naomi's husband and Ruth's to put this moment of choice in front of them. God did not force her to make this choice. God did not force Orpah to make the choice that she made, but he did use circumstances to put them in a place where the choice had to be made. Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her to Bethlehem, and so she stopped trying to talk her out of it. And the two women walk the road 75 miles or so from Moab back to Bethlehem. The entire town is excited to see Naomi back, and they say, "Is this Naomi?" I wonder if perhaps the losses she had suffered in Moab had showed on her face. Naomi means pleasant, but Naomi says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Now, Naomi had faith in God, but she did not seem to believe God has a plan for her life in her current situation. She wants to be called Mara, which means bitter. But do you notice the scriptures never call her Mara? They persist in calling her Naomi. Naomi thinks that bitterness is all that is ahead for her, but God has pleasant things for her. He's not done with her yet. Naomi was missing the providential care of God. He had provided Ruth to care for her. He had brought her home to a place where there was food. And according to the last verse of chapter 1, he brought them back to Bethlehem at the start of the barley harvest. Now, barley is the first crop that is harvested in the annual harvest season. And so that means that they had returned when there was a whole series of harvests ahead of them, the entire season of harvest still ahead of them, in which to glean in the fields, a maximum opportunity to glean food for their winter. God had brought them home at the right time. They're coming back with nothing. That means they're going to be gleaning food. Well, at least Ruth is, on behalf of Naomi. But God is providing. He has a redemptive plan for Naomi and for Ruth, and his plans are moving ahead. God took from Naomi to give her something better. God completes his redemptive plans, although bitterness can blind us to his provision. Are you in a Naomi situation? Sort of a dark time? Feeling empty or abandoned? Are you viewing your life or God through the lens of your losses? God has not stopped working. He has not stopped redeeming you from the damage of sin. He has something good ahead for you, and he is caring for you in the process. Is there bitterness in you over this situation? Where are you missing the care of God in your circumstances? How can you open up your eyes to the care of God and trust him in this dark time while you wait for his blessing? God is always more interested in our growth and our godliness than he is in our comfort. So now we pick up in chapters 2 and 3, and God brings a person into the lives of Naomi and Ruth who is God's provision for them. And this person is God's means of redemption for them. The concept of redemption is going to come up several times in this story. Redemption is the buying back of a person out of sin or slavery, or the buying back of land that has been lost. It always has the price of rescue in view. The price of our salvation is the death and blood of Jesus. He paid with his life for our sin. In this story, the concept of redemption in the spiritual sense is demonstrated by the price of money to preserve the physical lives of Naomi and Ruth. And just as a side note, notice how often Ruth is called Ruth the Moabitess. Her foreignness is emphasized, it's underscored in this passage. She has no inherent right to be here, and we are reminded of that over and over by this constant use of the title Ruth the Moabitess. Ruth goes out to glean, to gather dropped grain behind the harvesters in the fields. And it says in verse 3, as it turned out, she found herself working in the field belonging to Boaz. Well, there is no "it just so happened" moment in this story. Rather, this is God at work. It just so happened, as it turned out, that's from Ruth's perspective. But God is manipulating all of this for her good. Now, Boaz is a man of good character. He is a man of standing. He is respected in the community. He has position and probably influence. We will see that he has money, and he's also a believer in the Lord and has a great deal of kindness. He sees Ruth working in his field, and he is impressed. He hears from his officials that she is working hard, taking little time for rest. He asks who she is and is told that this is Ruth the Moabitess, who has come with Naomi. And he would have heard of her. Bethlehem was not a big town, and it was a small community. And although he may never have seen her before, he would have heard of the coming of this woman with Naomi. And he knows that she is there to help Naomi. So he offers to her that she can glean in his fields throughout the harvest. He instructs his men regarding how to treat her and tells her to watch where his servants work and to follow behind them so she doesn't risk straying into the field of a neighbor and perhaps getting abused or hurt by a neighbor into whose field she had strayed. Boaz then pronounces a blessing on her in chapter 2, verse 12. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Ruth goes home that first day, and she has quite a lot of grain with her. It says an ephah of grain. Now, she has threshed this grain, which means she's picked it up one stalk at a time, beaten it on the ground to get all those little tiny kernels out, and she has enough kernels of grain to have an ephah. That's a lot. That is 22 liters of grain. That is a massive amount of work she did in one day. And Naomi says, where were you working that you got this? And Ruth tells her that it is in the field of Boaz, and a light bulb comes on in Naomi's mind. So let's read verse 20. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." So Boaz has noticed Ruth, but things don't move ahead all that fast because Ruth goes through 2 harvests, which is weeks of backbreaking work in the fields of Boaz. The light bulb moment, however, leads Naomi to make a suggestion. She wants Ruth settled. She cares about Ruth and wants the best for her, while Ruth wants the best for Naomi. And this light bulb moment leads Naomi to make a suggestion. I'm sure you read her suggestion, and I wish I could ask all of you in person what you thought of it. Naomi suggested that Ruth wash herself and put on some perfume and her best clothes. Did that sound to you a little bit like seduction, maybe? Well, there are 2 other places in Scripture in which these same instructions are given and these same actions are taken, and they might be kind of instructive for us. The first one is in 2 Samuel 12, verse 20, where David is putting off the mourning clothes that he has been wearing as he has been mourning the death of his infant son. And he does these same 3 things. He washes himself, he puts on lotion, which would be perfumed, and he puts on fresh clothes. The other one is in Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 8 to 14, and it's a symbolic description of Israel as the bride of God. It is a picture of a bride preparing herself for her wedding, and these same 3 actions are taken: bathing, perfuming, and fresh clothes. I wonder if Ruth is not setting up a seduction, but is putting off her mourning. Perhaps she has been dressed as a widow in mourning garments, sending a signal that she is not here to get a husband for herself. She is here for Naomi. She is here to care for her, but Naomi is asking her to put aside her mourning. To move forward, God sometimes has to have us leave certain things behind. To move forward within a relationship, a new relationship, she's going to have to lay aside her identity with her old marriage. Naomi seems to believe God has something more for Ruth, and so her mourning has to be left behind. Ruth obeys. And then she goes to the place where Boaz is threshing. And there is a use of some unusual language in chapter 3, verse 9. At least it's unusual to us. "Spread the corner of your garment over me." Now, it doesn't sound like this to us, but this is a marriage proposal. She is asking to be taken under the protection of Boaz via marriage. She says that she is asking this because he is a kinsman redeemer. So let me explain a little bit about a kinsman redeemer. This role is described in the Old Testament, and sometimes a person had to sell their land because they didn't have the ability to work it and they didn't have enough money to pay their debts. Sometimes, if they were really destitute, they had to sell themselves into slavery in order to put a roof over their head and food in their stomach. And a person could purchase back out of the possession of whoever bought it, either the land or the person. They could be redeemed, the price paid, and they could be bought back. And there were 3 qualifications to be a kinsman redeemer. First, the person must be a near relative. Secondly, the person must have the ability to pay the price. And third, they must be willing. The kinsman redeemer was not obligated to pay this big cost on behalf of someone else. They must be willing to do it. This is a picture of what Jesus offers us. We have a debt that we cannot pay, the debt of our sin. Jesus has the means to pay it because he has no debt of sin of his own, and he is willing to do so. He is related to us in our humanity. He is our kinsman redeemer, or our guardian redeemer, as some versions call it. What Ruth is doing is asking Boaz to buy the land, to redeem it. And we will see, if you look at chapter 4, verse 3, that Naomi was going to have to sell her husband's land. And Ruth was also, however, asking for something else. She's asking for levirate marriage. Now, levirate marriage was something that was practiced when a man died, leaving a widow behind, but having had no children. Then the brother of the dead man would be expected to marry his brother's widow, and the first son born in that marriage would be considered for legal purposes the son of the first husband and would inherit the first husband's land. And this would allow the first husband's name to remain in the genealogies of the nation, but also would allow his land to remain in the hands of close family. Ruth is asking Boaz to offer her levirate marriage, in spite of the fact that he's not the brother of her dead husband, and he is not obligated to do that. And she is asking for him to buy the land of Elimelech, and then that land would pass on to the son that she has with Boaz. He would have to purchase the land that he would not get to keep. He would have to support Ruth and Naomi and the child, all for the sake of the name of Elimelech and of Ruth's first husband. And Boaz actually admires Ruth for suggesting this. Now, just a bit of a romance crusher here. Jewish tradition suggests that Boaz was considerably older than Ruth, possibly even as old as 80. This was not young love romance. Sorry to ruin your, romance novel cover view of what's going on here. But Boaz admires her for her dedication to the name of the dead and her desire to provide stability and a home for Naomi. But there's a hitch to the plan. There is a relative that's closer to Elimelech relationally than Boaz. And that person has the first right to redeem Elimelech's land. So Boaz says that in the morning, he's going to go and find out if this other man wants to redeem the land and marry Ruth. And if he does not, Boaz promises that he will do so. God provided for Naomi and for Ruth by providing a redeemer. Ruth knew the redeemer. She had worked in his field. She knew who was equipped to rescue her, who had the means and the character and the kindness to do it. She has no right to this redemption. She has no means of providing for her own rescue, but she knew who had the means to do it, and he was willing. And only Jesus is willing and able to redeem us. Now, the redemption that Boaz provided was not a one-time thing. It was ongoing. It included a home for both women, food to eat, a roof over their heads. It meant an end to gleaning in fields for their daily food. It meant a baby who would inherit the land of Elimelech and work that land when he was old enough. It meant a provision for both of them when Boaz was dead and gone. It was an active, ongoing redemption. Jesus, our Redeemer, provided for us when we could not save ourselves. Only he was qualified to shed his blood and give his perfect life for us. Ruth simply asked, and redemption was hers. The same happens to us. We simply ask, and Jesus willingly provides. He then works ongoingly to redeem us from the effects of sin in our lives, to provide a home for us in heaven, to support and care for us every single day. Since you have a Redeemer, how can you trust him today while you wait for him to turn your bitterness to blessing? Now in chapter 4, Boaz wastes no time. He goes the next morning to the city gate, and he has a conversation with the man who is a closer relative. He asks that man if he wants to purchase the land of Elimelech. The guy initially says yes, but then Boaz tells him that he must also marry Ruth and raise up the child in the name of the dead. And then the man says he cannot do it. So Boaz marries Ruth and purchases the land. He redeems the land and provides for Ruth and Naomi. I'm going to read from chapter 4, verses 13 to 15. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." The Lord enabled Ruth to conceive. She apparently had been barren before this. The Lord had kept her from having children until now, where she was in a place of blessing for her. And the baby born is Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David the king. So Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David. This is God's blessing for Ruth and Naomi. God brought them here for this. But the blessing God gives them goes way beyond their immediate lives, because from David the king, the line of Ruth goes all the way to Jesus the Messiah, the ultimate Redeemer. Ruth is in the lineage of the Christ. God's redemptive work is fruitful far beyond what we can ever see in the moment. God's redemption brings more blessing than we can ever imagine. The loss suffered in Moab was a deliberate action on the part of God. It was his providential care and his redemptive plan. It had a cost. But though Ruth and Naomi lost in Moab, they gained so much more in Bethlehem. Naomi got the redemption of her land and security for herself. She got a child to carry on the name of her husband and son. Ruth got to be a part of the people of God by faith through God's redemption of her, and she is in the genealogy of Christ. Jesus gave us redemption from sin. He provided eternal life, but so much more than anything we ever lose along the way. The losses are of his choosing, but they are not mean-spirited. They are to give us more than what we lose, more than we can imagine. God's redemptive work is always moving forward in the lives of his people. He is working in your life today. He always perfectly shelters those who come to him. You may be in a dark or bitter time, but blessing is coming. How have you noticed the blessing he is bringing into your life? You know your Redeemer, and you can trust him. He won't stop working till he brings you into the full blessing that he has planned for you.